Hello friends, I'm Michael Kingswood and this is Storytime. We are continuing with my favorite series introduction. Glimmervale Chronicles #1, the start of my heroic fantasy series that all of you should be reading if you haven't already. And we're sharing it here on Tuesdays, as well as over on Substack and on the Arcade and Comics site because I love you, want you to be happy, and get sucked into the series and buy lots of books because you like it so much. Fortunately for you, I did not read this one. I hired a voice actor to read this one. I know. It's fine. It's cool when the author reads this stuff, and you've got a decent voice, Kingswood. Oh, thanks for saying that, but let's be honest. Actual voice actors are better than guys who are not. So we are sharing that today. This is Chapter 5, called The Oarlock.
Chapter 5, The Oarlock. The Oarlock turned out to be a fair-sized inn a block and a half away from the docks. 2 stories tall, it was a simple building, and far from new, but it had obviously been well maintained over the years by a very conscientious owner. A simple sign showing a bearded man in foul weather gear pulling along the oars of a rowboat in rough seas with the inn's name written in the waves hung from a wrought iron stanchion on the street. Raedric needed no directions to find it. He led Julian to the inn stables as quickly as if he had been going between the constable's office and the inn every day for his whole life. Julian thought he knew what made Raedric tick after all the time they had spent together at the front, but his familiarity with the Vale and its inhabitants had come as a surprise. He reminded himself to ask about it after they were settled and nursing a tankard. The interior was not very much different from any other inn Julian had visited. A long wooden bar rested along the wall to his right as he walked inside. Tables with chairs for 4 lay scattered around the room, and there were a half-dozen booths built into the wall to his left. A set of swinging doors in the back no doubt led into the kitchen, and a stairwell in the left rear corner led upstairs. 2 fireplaces, one in each of the front corners, provided warmth and some light. About 24 customers sat around the various tables or on stools at the bar. One table in particular, in the right rear corner of the tap room, was particularly popular. 7 men and a lone woman clustered around it. A dice game, unless Julian missed his guess. 2 powerfully built men sat on stools at either end of the bar. The fact that they were facing away from the taps and toward the rest of the room screamed that they were bouncers. Raedric made a beeline for the bar. Julian followed more slowly. The bartender was a balding man in his early middle years. He had the bland look of a man who had listened to enough drunkards to no longer pay any mind to what they have to say. Raedric waved at him, but he took his time in coming over. When he finally arrived, the bartender looked Raedric, then Julian, up and down and sniffed. "Looking for a room, eh, boys?" Raedric looked around the room again before answering. "Is Molly here tonight?" The bartender nodded. "She is. She's dealing with something right now, though, but I can set you up." Raedric shook his head. "We'll wait for her. Thanks." The bartender shrugged and turned away. That wouldn't do at all. Julian spoke up. "We'll take a drink while we wait." "Yeah, what'll it be?" The bartender sounded annoyed. His expression as he looked back at them over his shoulder confirmed it. Julian said, "Mulled wine." He glanced at Raedric and added, "2 of them." The bartender nodded and moved away to the center of the bar, where several tapped casks sat on their sides. He returned a short time later with 2 steaming tankards and set them down on the bar in front of Raedric. "2 pennies, he said. Raedric fished a couple coins from his pouch and paid the man, then handed one of the tankards to Julian. The aroma of the mulling spices combined with the wine's natural nose made Julian's mouth water, and he suddenly realized how hungry he was. Not surprising, considering their small, hurried lunch earlier. "Probably ought to get some dinner, too," he said before taking a drink. The wine was just as good as he anticipated, bringing a smile to his lips. "Yes, definitely. But first, I'd like to—" Raedric broke off as a portly woman with gray hair tied in a bun atop her head stepped into the room from the kitchens. She wore a simple dress with a bright white apron over top and took a moment to survey the tap room before heading over to the bar. She conferred with the bartender for a moment. He gestured down the bar toward Julian and Raedric, and she looked over at them, her expression one of curiosity. Then she said something else, which the bartender acknowledged with a nod, and made her way toward them. She stopped along the way to exchange pleasantries with a group of customers and was still chuckling from something they said when she reached Julian and Raedric. Wiping her hands on her apron, she looked them up and down for a moment before speaking. "I'm Molly. What can I do for you?" "We're looking for a room," Julian began, but Raedric cut him off. "You may not remember, but you used to do business with my father, Roland Bolatier." Balatier. Molly repeated the name slowly, as though she was tasting every syllable. Then her eyes widened. Woodworker who traveled with Crispin Thunderly. She smiled, a broad grin that changed her expression from severe and businesslike to warm and inviting. Why, you wouldn't be little Raedric, would you? At his nod, she laughed and clapped him on his arms, then pulled him in for a hug. Well, look at you, boy, all grown up. What brings you back through these parts? Heading home from the front. Molly's mirth faded. Well, I'm glad you're able to. I've heard it's brutal out on the front lines. She had no idea. Julian thought. If she knew half of what had happened out there. Well, she didn't, and he had no intention of describing it. Neither did Raedric, apparently, as he simply shrugged and looked away. Julian knew him well enough to recognize the guarded expression that hinted at emotion ready to burst out in a torrent. Clearing his throat, Julian said, Mistress Millens, I'm Julian Hinderbrook, and offered her his hand. Molly turned to him and shook his hand with a warm smile. My pleasure, Julian. Call me Molly. You and Raedric know each other from the army, I assume? Yes, ma'am. We finished with the army at the same time, and he told me so many good things about Malterabor that I decided to come along to see what the fuss was about. Is that where your father keeps himself these days? She asked, looking back at Raedric. I haven't heard from him in 10 years? 15? I hope he's well. Raedric had his emotions under control again. He smiled and made a dismissive gesture. He always finds a way to do well. I haven't heard from him in 6 months or so, but last I heard he was on the verge of making a killing in some business deal or other. Shaking her head, Molly laughed merrily. That does sound like him. Stepping back, she looked them over again. Well, looks like you two could use a bath, a meal, and a bed. You're in luck. I have one more room empty. Follow me. Molly led them up the staircase at the back of the tap room. It was a tough climb, with every step painfully straining the stitches in Julian's thigh. He took his time, but even still, he wasn't at all certain he hadn't pulled some of the stitches out by the time he reached the top. Molly eyed him askance as he stepped, breathing hard from the pain, off the landing. A strapping young man like you shouldn't have so much trouble with one flight of stairs, she quipped. What's wrong with your leg? Brigands on the road, he replied through gritted teeth. Got me in the thigh. Molly's eyes narrowed as she looked down at Julian's leg. Where did this happen? Just above the falls, Raedric replied. We brought one of them into the constable before we came here. Molly mumbled something under her breath. Julian was not really surprised to hear a few salty curses in there, ladylike or not. She did run a tavern after all. More loudly, she said, Farzel's bunch? They nodded. Figures. Well, you're safe now. Come on. She set off down the hall, leaving Julian and Raedric to look quizzically at each other. That was awfully fatalistic, Julian said. Raedric nodded. The Molly I remember was no nonsense. Wouldn't tolerate trouble from anyone. His eyes moved to follow Molly as she moved down the hall. First the deputy, and now Molly. Who is this Farzel fellow? Dunno, but it's not our problem, is it? Julian limped down the hall after Molly. He glanced over his shoulder several paces on. Raedric hadn't moved an inch, and he wore a very troubled expression. Their room was all the way at the end of the hall on the left, just before the hall made a turn to the right. It was about the same as every other room Julian had ever rented out. It had 2 narrow beds against the wall on opposite sides of the room, a locking chest at the foot of each bed, a chest of drawers beneath the window, a hanging wardrobe in one corner, and a wash basin and mirror in the other. The window was curtained and constructed so the lower half could be opened outward. All in all, not too bad. Molly smiled apologetically as she showed them the room. I wish my premium rooms were available for you boys, she said, but they were rented out 2 days ago. I hope this will be okay. It's perfect, ma'am, Julian said. Raedric echoed him, and Molly smiled a bit more broadly. The baths are across the hall, and the privy is around the corner. When you've cleaned up, come downstairs and I'll have dinner ready for you. Thank you, Molly, Raedric said. It's great to see you again, she replied. She turned to leave, but before closing the door behind her, she looked over her shoulder and gave Raedric a conspiratorial look. Don't be too long. Lonnie should be back soon, and I know she'll want to catch up. Molly pulled the door shut. The click of the latch sounded solid and, for some reason, comforting. Julian tossed his saddlebag onto his bed and began removing his belongings from the pouches. Who's Lonnie? He asked. Raedric was still looking at the door. At Julian's words, he gave a start, then, smiling abashedly, set about unpacking. She's Molly's daughter. We used to play together when my father and I came through here. She used to say I was her best friend. He paused for a moment. I always liked her, but... Raedric looked over at Julian and shrugged. She was also a bit odd. I didn't understand how I could be her best friend since we came through so infrequently. Julian shrugged. Girls are hard to understand sometimes. That's an understatement. I thought you said your father owned a ranch in the hills above Molterabor. How did you come to pass through here so often? Raedric paused again. He does now. For a long time, though, he made his living as a woodworker. He made high-quality tools, furniture, and toys that his friend Crispin sold from city to city. After my mother died, he couldn't bear to stay in our town anymore. So he convinced Crispin that they could make more money if he joined the caravan and made his products continually on the road. And he was right. The money flowed like never before. But more than money, we made many great friends, like Molly and Lonnie. Of course, we eventually got tired of traveling all the time. In truth, I think he tired of it before I did. Chuckling softly, Raedric looked back at Julian and grinned. But that might be because he met a lovely young widow whose late husband was a big-time rancher. Julian chuckled as well. I can understand that. Glad to hear it all worked out. Raedric nodded. It did.
All right, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, Kingswood, I love that story. How can I buy your books? Great question. Here's the answer. Best way to buy my books is to come over to my site, michaelkingswood.com/store. That will bring you to this place, which is my company's store where you can get books, merchandise, all kinds of great stuff that I've set up. And but you're wondering how it works. Well, here, let's check out Glimmer Chronicles, which is my heroic fantasy series that I've talked a lot about. If you haven't read it yet, you really should. It's a super fun series. Everything you would want. You should start with Glimmer, which is the first book. Come over here to Glimmer. It'll load up. Hey, look at that. You get the book description, links to other books in the series, great stuff. And you can pick the format you want. You got ebook, trade paperback, and audiobook. Not everything I've written is an audiobook yet, but almost everything's a trade paperback and everything's an ebook. But like, hey, I know what you're thinking. Hey, I'm buying from you. How do I get the ebook? There's a service that I work with called Book Funnel. When you buy from my site, they will send you a link. That link will lead you to a page where they will walk you through how to load your ebook onto the device you're choosing, or you can just download it to computer and do whatever you want with it. So that way it's easy peasy. Maximum profit for me. All kinds of fun for you. But I know, a lot of you guys, you like your Kindles, you like your other things, and you want to go straight to the retailer, and that's fine. You can come over here to michaelkingswood.com/books2read, the number 2. And I have this handy dandy universal book link aggregator page set up. You can scroll through, look at all my stories, all my books, and pick which one you want, and then go from there. Here's how it works. Let's do Glimmer again. So Glimmer, first book in the series, you click on it, you get this thing, you get the book description, you get all other books in the series, and you say, get it now. Okay, get it now. Look what happens. Every retailer where you can find it is here. You can pick the one that you like best and say, okay, cool. Well, let's say I wanted to buy it in, I don't know, let's just say Kobo, because why not? Click on it. And then it'll ask you, is this your favorite store? If so, you set it so every time you come back, you don't have to choose. It'll just go take you to your favorite store. But let's just, you don't have to do that. Well, we're going on to Kobo. Hoo-yah. Hey, look at this. Here it is on the Kobo site. People like it. People have bought it. Good stuff. Links to other things of mine. And, or you can do one of the other stores that you like. Either way, you get the book you like. I get money. It's all good. Either way you choose to do it is awesome. I thank you in advance for your readership, and I hope you enjoy it.